Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, Peter Giacone, Senior Managing Director and Head of KBRA's insurance team, interviews Dr. Ryan Truchelut, co-founder, president, and Chief Meteorologist of WeatherTiger. WeatherTiger provides customized seasonal weather forecasts and full-spectrum decision support for commodity, weather risk, public safety, and retail markets, with a proprietary technology fusing meteorological insights and the power of big data. In Ryan's 11 years as a lead professional meteorologist, he has provided mission-critical forecast guidance and consulting to satisfy clients across the full spectrum of agricultural markets, including producers, processors, end users, and traders. Ryan's comprehensive knowledge of client needs and deep background in mid and long-range forecasting, quantification of extreme event risk, and innovative product development are at the forefront of the field and inform every WeatherTiger forecast.
So Ryan, thank you for joining us today. Very excited to be speaking with you today and learning more about your firm. Just to start things off, if you could give us just a little bit of background in terms of what was the motivation that you had behind founding WeatherTiger and what products does your firm offer currently to the market?
Of course. Well, Peter, thanks so much for having me today. I am a person who has a lifelong love of weather. I grew up in Orlando and, we don't have snow days in Central Florida. So what we have are hurricane days. And I loved getting off of school. So hurricanes were my lifeline for being out of school. So I then stayed in school for 20 years studying hurricanes, of course. I started working in the agricultural futures market as an undergrad, as I was working towards a degree in geosciences, and then a master's and a doctorate in meteorology. And that really gave me kind of a market-oriented experience on what do people need out of weather forecasting? What do people want? What's useful? Where's the value add? And when I was in graduate school, my research focus was on understanding why some busy hurricane seasons that produce a lot of hurricanes don't produce very many landfalls and vice versa. So again, I was kind of focused on a more practical consideration, something oriented towards impacts. And after graduation, my co-founder at WeatherTiger, Dr. Erica Staling, and I realized that the tools and technologies that we developed over our academic lifetime, we really were bringing together this practical forecasting know-how, market experience working with clients, as well as academic chops. And those are three things that don't really all go together. They're rare to find, together in one company. So when we started WeatherTiger because we wanted to produce short range and seasonal forecasts for our clients that are useful, that add the most value possible, and of course are the most accurate and accurately calibrated probabilistically as they possibly can be. So we apply that philosophy of being useful and usable to agricultural commodity forecasting. We've got short range products and seasonal outlooks for the major agricultural commodities. We're developing agricultural yield modeling using weather inputs. We'll get back to that a little bit later on. Probably best known at WeatherTiger for our hurricane forecasting. We're on Substack at weathertiger.substack.com, where we have a huge following that's growing every day. And I also write a column that's syndicated in USA Today papers nationwide on hurricane forecasting and hurricane science. Side note, we actually have at WeatherTiger the most accurate hurricane seasonal modeling over the last 5 years as measured by seasonalhurricaneoutlooks.org. And finally, we also provide meteorological consulting and expert witness services, both to the insurance industry as well as to clients like the state of Florida. I'm based in Tallahassee, so we're co-located with the state government of Florida and provide an expert perspective on some of the hurricane risks that the state is facing.
That's quite a large remit that you cover there, Ryan, to say the least. Just moving on, the increased interest in ESG considerations across so many sectors of the capital markets and investors, large institutions like insurance companies, as well as even just down to the retail level, are demanding more and more information on climate change. Have you seen increased interest in WeatherTiger's products as a result of these emerging trends in the market?
We absolutely have. And just within the past couple of years, the pandemic, as well as geopolitical upheaval, those are other things that have also driven appetite for the accurate quantification of weather risks. We've had a lot of new clients come to us in the past 2 years because it really feels like, I think both from an insider and an outsider perspective, that the rubber's starting to hit the road on climate change. We're seeing increased frequency of extreme precipitation, extreme heat events, and those are things that have major impacts on the agricultural markets, insurance, and many, many other industries. It's undeniable at this point that weather impacts the bottom line of almost every business, both in your obvious fields like insurance that have been at this for decades, and less obvious markets like retail demand. That you just can't get by as a major Fortune 500 company without having cutting edge weather intelligence to improve your logistics, as well as to quantify and manage your extreme weather risks. Every business has them.
As you're probably aware, here at KBRA, we view ESG through the lens of management and are increasingly having conversations with issuers about their environmental risk exposures and how they're working to actively manage that risk and capitalize on any opportunities. So it's not just about the downside, there's also a lot of opportunity out there as well. And we're trying to focus on both sides of it here at KBRA. Climate change is clearly a very big topic for any catastrophe-exposed insurers. So we'll certainly be interested to hear how WeatherTiger's products help insurers, as well as governments and other market participants, as you alluded to, understand their exposure to climate-related risks.
Well, there's a couple ways that we do that. And I think the first one that is probably our better known, more public-facing aspect is our seasonal outlooks and our consulting for tropical cyclone risks. There's a lot that we know about climate change that scientists are very, very confident on. And unfortunately, tropical cyclones and how hurricanes, those patterns will change going forward is more subtle. There's more disagreement in the scientific community. So we really view ourselves here, the scientific team that we have, we've written a lot of peer-reviewed papers on this kind of subject. We are trying to help people understand how and why tropical cyclone risks are changing, as well as understand the history of what the historical record shows your risks would be for any given location or for a government or a business, their particular exposures. Those risks that we need to explain, they often come in the form of extreme precipitation risks or changing patterns of where the storms are moving and developing with time. There's some things that we can feel more confident in advising our clients are changing, are happening. And then there's some places where we would say, well, we'll need more time to see whether these trends are real or whether they're caused by chance. The way that climate change feeds back into tropical cyclone activity is tricky, and it's something that we help our clients understand as we work one-on-one with them. Another field where I think we're really finding a lot of interest for our products is in agricultural yield modeling, which I'd alluded to earlier. WeatherTiger was founded to produce best-in-class seasonal outlooks for temperature and precipitation. And really, whatever a client brings to us as their weather challenge, we can build you a seasonal model to predict that and give you the uncertainty around our predictions. Clients find that to be very useful, very intuitive in terms of understanding that and turning it into a decision. In agricultural meteorology, we've been obviously working very hard on seasonal modeling for the weather influences on crop growth, which are temperature and precipitation primarily. And in the past few years, we've decided to go one step further. Rather than just providing the temperature and precipitation forecast to an end user and asking them to kind of, in their mind, turn that into a market strategy or turn that into an idea of how that's going to influence crop development qualitatively inside their heads and then translate that into a market decision, we have built models that actually in real time take rainfall and temperature input in key agricultural growing regions and turn that into a model of what the agricultural production for a particular crop is going to be. So we have corn and soybean models where we're modeling county by county across the continental United States to determine what our estimate of yield and production is going to be. And we've been running this model for 3 years now, and we've found that we were able to beat the USDA projections, both in terms of accuracy and in time. We're able to give our clients this information several weeks ahead of time before the USDA numbers come out. And that's extremely useful for risk hedging. And it's also extremely useful in terms of identifying as a grower and a producer how to sell your crop, how to hedge your exposures, and how to prepare for the weather risks in the season ahead. We have tools and technologies that are pointing to drought probabilities, for instance. What's the possibility that your farm tips into a significant or serious drought over the course of a growing season? If you know that information ahead of time, you can mitigate. There's things that you can do both in terms of financial exposures and in terms of managing the crops, planting, drought or heat resistant crops, planting different crops if you're expecting different weather. And those are all considerations that have helped our clients be more efficient in their agricultural production.
That's great, Ryan. Thanks for that color and background. Switching back to hurricanes, you were a co-author on a recently published research paper that examined the relationship between warming ocean temperatures and the North Atlantic hurricane season. Can you share some of the findings? And in particular, would really love to hear of any surprises you might have encountered in the course of doing such exhaustive research.
Well, this research came about over the last 5 or 6 years, and it started with the note that we have had an extraordinary number of tropical cyclones develop in the Atlantic Ocean, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, before the official start of hurricane season on June 1st. In fact, every hurricane season between 2014 and 2021, a tropical cyclone developed prior to June 1st. And in 7 of those cases, watches and warnings were required to be issued by the National Hurricane Center for the continental US, again, before the start of hurricane season. So, as a hurricane climatologist, when I see something like that, it's an interesting trend. It's something that is worth studying further. And it's worth studying further to better understand whether it's the result of chance alone. Is it something that's significant? There's a trend that's likely to continue. And what's driving that trend? So I worked with a number of other leading scientists in hurricane climatology and hurricane research, including Phil Klotzbach at Colorado State, Kim Wood at Mississippi State, Carl Schreck, as well as Eric Blake, the National Hurricane Center, Dan Halperin at Embry-Riddle, and my partner at WeatherTiger, Erica Staling. We worked together for a couple of years to put together a very rigorous methodology to make sure that we were detecting a trend that was real and then attributing that trend and trying to get at what was causing that trend. If it was real, what's causing it, and can we expect it to continue in the future? So what we found, first result, was we found that there is a significant trend that does not appear to be driven by chance alone towards an earlier start of risk onset from tropical cyclones for the Atlantic Basin, both in terms of United States landfalls, where we can go back to 1900 and have some degree of trust that the data set is relatively complete, as well as for all named storms starting in the 70s. We saw trends earlier in landfalls of about 2 days earlier of that first U.S. landfall of a named storm per decade, and about 5 days earlier per decade of the first named storm in general in the Atlantic since the 1970s. So that trend is real. It appears to be continuing through this day. And in fact, even the pace of it seems to be accelerating. And the odds of that being caused by chance alone are well less than 1% for both landfalls and the initial named storms. So furthermore, we wanted to understand why that was happening. And we took a close look at the background, the ingredients that go into having a tropical cyclone develop. And we took a look at things like ocean temperatures and how much moisture there is in the mid-levels of the atmosphere 2 to 4 miles up, wind shear. We wanted to understand how the environment was changing in May that was making it more likely for tropical cyclones to develop. And what we found was that for a lot of those ingredients like shear and moisture, there really wasn't much of a trend with time. There wasn't much of a change in those parameters. And some of those parameters also didn't really exercise much control over when the season starts, over those first few percentage points of Atlantic activity. The dominant influence by far is ocean temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Caribbean, and the Southwest Atlantic in the vicinity of the Bahamas, which is where those early season storms have been developing. And what we found is that for every degree the water temperatures get warmer in the spring in that area, you're moving the start of hurricane season earlier by about a month. And that warming trend is continuing. That part of the Atlantic is warming even faster than other parts of the global tropical oceans, which are warming as well. That is what appears to be driving that trend towards earlier development. That has implications for how we define hurricane season and many other things. And just as something that was kind of surprising to us, people ask us all the time, well, is hurricane season getting longer on the other end? Is it ending later? And we tested that. We looked at every basically percentile of the hurricane season going back, 40, 50 years, going back 120 years for landfalls to see if that's moving. And the answer is it's not. The time that you would expect the hurricane season to be 10 or 50 or 90% done has not changed. Peak of the hurricane season, right in mid-September, right where it's always been. So there is a little bit of a trend in the very last few percentile at the end of the season, but it's not significant. So stay tuned. Check back in 20 years and we'll see if there's a more significant trend. But it kind of makes sense for it to be only moving forward at the beginning of the season because start of the season is controlled by sea surface temperatures, and the end of the season is more controlled by wind shear. The winds just get very unfavorable in the Atlantic for tropical storm development. Waters are plenty warm enough in November and even in December for tropical storms to form, but the wind shear is kind of the key consideration to shut the season down. So we'll check back in 10 years and see if the season is moving later as well. But for now, it's just the start of the season that's changing.
Well, whether it's 10 years or 20 years, we'll be sure to stay in touch with you, Ryan. That much I can count on. So, what does the earlier onset of hurricane season mean for insurers and as well as just companies more broadly and governments? What are some of the implications of that, and how might these various entities and stakeholders begin to think about that and adjust the way they mitigate the risk on a go-forward basis?
Well, I think the key consideration here that this is going to be a contributor to a larger conversation is how do we define hurricane season? The definition of it has not changed since 1965, June 1st through November 30th. Initially, hurricane season was informally defined as the dates that a telegraph line was established to connect various Weather Bureau offices along the Gulf and the East Coast that only was in place during hurricane season. So it actually comes, our definition of hurricane season does not have a rigorous scientific definition. It is something that is a social construct that we've acquired from telegraph lines, believe it or not. So there's a broader conversation going on at the World Meteorological Organization, as well as within NOAA, of we need to have a more formal definition of hurricane season. We need to have something that is rigorous, is testable, and can change with time if needed. There's a panel within NOAA that's working towards a definition right now. I believe they're going to have at least something to discuss and more publicly coming up in 2023. But this paper that was just released really kind of steps into this fray and provides a more rigorous fundamental basis for making that decision. There really hadn't been a paper about the mechanisms of the onset of tropical cyclone risks for about 7 or 8 years in the peer-reviewed scientific press. And of course, within that 8 years, we had all these storms, including Alberto in 2018, that unfortunately caused a number of deaths as it moved inland and caused flooding, damage of $125 million or more in North Carolina and Virginia as it moved inland Memorial Day weekend of 2018. There hadn't been a scientific paper that kind of took all that new information into account. So this does. And of course, that's a conversation that many stakeholders need to be a part of, from emergency management to science communicators and forecasters at the NHC. Defining when hurricane season is really important because it tells people when they need to be prepared. The messaging of when do I need to have my hurricane plan in place for the upcoming hurricane season. There's Hurricane Awareness Week now that's at the end of May, ahead of the June 1st start of the season. Potentially people should have updated hurricane plans, earlier than that. Maybe we need people to be ready in mid-May, not for a major hurricane, but for the flood risks that accompany some of these early season storms. And I think having that conversation about the definition of hurricane season, it changes the focus of what we're preparing for. People think of hurricanes as wind and surge. And of course, those are fundamental perils associated with hurricanes. But I think an underrepresented risk, certainly in the mind of the general public, is precipitation. And unfortunately, freshwater flooding, flash flooding, accounts for 30% of the casualties from tropical cyclones, as well as over a third of the damage. Events like Harvey or Tropical Storm Allison in the Houston area, those weren't wind events. They were freshwater flood events caused by excessive precipitation. And there's very strong evidence suggesting that extreme precipitation events from tropical cyclones will increase with frequency in the future with continuing climate change. Changing the definition of hurricane season, that pushes renewal dates back in the insurance market. It changes the idea of, when people want to go on cruises to the Caribbean because it signals, well, maybe, it's not risk-free to go before hurricane season, if the definition of hurricane season changes. So it changes some retail behavior, it changes some corporate behavior. But I think the really key consideration is that if hurricane season, the definition is changed to May 15th as the new start date, I think there will probably be a greater awareness or a greater push through emergency management and risk communicators that excessive precipitation is not a secondary risk of tropical cyclones. It is very much a primary risk, and it's something that people need to be every bit as prepared to react to and take life-saving action to protect their property, protect their lives as wind or surge. So I think, this paper will contribute to that conversation in that way, of I think refocusing the risks and balancing what people's perception of the risks from hurricanes are going forward.
I couldn't agree with you more, Ryan. It's definitely an evolving risk landscape, and there are a lot of perils now that are being viewed in a very different lens relative to the way they were even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. So I definitely agree with you on a number of the points you just made. I guess just to kind of end on a positive note, as a meteorologist and as an expert in seasonal forecasting and predictive analytics, when it comes to climate change and the future of adaptation and resiliency, which you alluded to a bit in your previous comments, what gives you the most hope as we move forward into sort of a new era, if you would, of hurricane forecasting and climate change and how all these things come together for our global economy?
I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And one of the biggest reasons why I feel optimistic about, our ability to come to a consensus on both what to do about climate change and as well as how to manage those risks and be resilient to the risks that are unavoidable. It's my one-on-one work with WeatherTiger clients. I mean, we work with people across the spectrum of American life and in many different industries and many different walks of life. And, everybody who's in business, the common denominator is money talks. And when you understand the risks from extreme and severe weather, some of which are driven by climate change that are facing your business, you're going to react rationally. If you are given a rational, non-ideological set of data and set of information, and you're working with someone you trust, and we work with people, in rural America who have undeniably felt the impacts of climate change, and they're making business decisions based on good information. The information that we give them when we present it to them, it's something that they can take away from and make a decision about how to make their business more resilient, about how to allocate their resources. We've helped businesses, for instance, decide where to put new processing facilities. So based on where demand is going to change for the way the weather was likely to change over the next 20 or 30 years, where is demand for their product likely to be greatest? Where will it fall? Where will it increase? That non-ideological lens of approaching this as a question of dollars and cents and as a question of good management practices from within a business, I think it really breaks through a lot of the log jam. And I think it can, good information and accurate predictions, they are superior to just opinion, basically. When you make a prediction and it comes true, you gain trust. So I think gaining the trust of our clients and working one-on-one with them has really given me a lot of hope. And, I think that just we're starting to move forward on these questions a little bit, just, taking the heat and the vitriol out of it and just looking at this question objectively of what's happening, what can we do about it? How can we make good macro scale decisions? And how can I, use weather information to make good micro scale decisions to manage my business the most effectively, take care of my people in my enterprise, and be a good steward of the resources that we're entrusted with.
Sounds like some great advice, Ryan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Peter. And I invite all your listeners to come visit us at weathertiger.substack.com. We have a real-time hurricane season ACE model that we update every day, and we're going to keep updating it every day through the end of October. So all the way to the bitter end of the season. So come check it out.
Thank you to Ryan and Peter for a very interesting discussion. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG weekly roundup newsletter. This concludes our episode. New episodes of ESG Talks air every other week. In the meantime, please visit kbra.com to access our other podcast series as well as our ratings and research.